Hi Booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'd like to do a very simple tag that I've been meaning to do for a bit, and I'm getting into the habit now where if I'm not able to do the tag on Tag Tuesday, instead of putting it off until next Tag Tuesday, I'm just going to do it whenever I can. So this is the 8 Bookish Memories tag. It was created by Paul, the accidental bookseller, and I was tagged by Pat from Book Chat with Pat. And it's a simple idea for a tag. There's only really one prompt, which is to gather 6 books from your shelves that evoke memories, much in the way that a certain song, might remind you of a time in your life. And you can go into as much detail about the memories that they evoke, and yeah, it just seems like a really lovely idea for a tag. There's a little message from Paul, so that if you want to do the tag, and I'll leave it open to anyone if you want to do it, but if you want to do it, I'll have his little message there, so it'll give you an idea of what to look for. My approach was a little bit backwards. I decided to kind of think of the memories or the periods of my life that I wanted to think about, and then sort of let the books themselves bubble up into the surface. And there's a bit of cheating here. One thing, I've got a pile of 9 books here, not 8 books. That'll become apparent as it goes on. But also, some of these aren't books necessarily, it's poems and things like that. So we'll work through them as we get to them. And it's split rather neatly in half. So we've got really 4/5 books for childhood and adolescence, and then really the second 4 books are for after I left home and went to university and stuff. So we've got a nice sort of splitting of different periods of my life there. And so we'll start off with childhood, and they're particularly the kind of grown-up books that have sort of stayed with me that I can remember from childhood. And the first one I wanted to talk about was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this is one of the times where it's a specific poem rather than an entire book, and it's the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which, to be fair, my dad did have in a separate volume with I think it was the Gustave Doré illustrations, and so it was very dramatic. It felt like a very grown-up and exciting book, and yeah, I can remember that being very alive and having bits read out and going through the illustrations, and that was one of a few poems that he would read to us when we were little. Like I think I can remember him reading The Raven as well, and it's just one of those poems that it's just like the sensibility of it, the strangeness of it, the and just the meter and the the sort of ballad quality of it. I've just opened it up. The sun right up above the mast had fixed her to the ocean, but in a minute she 'gan stir with a short uneasy motion, backwards and forwards half a length with a short uneasy motion. Then like a pouring horse let go she made a sudden bound. It flung the blood into my head, and I fell down in a swound. How long in that same fit I lay, I have not to declare, but ere my living life returned, I heard and in my soul discerned 2 voices in the air. And then this weird bit with these polar spirits talking about the mariner. But it's brilliant, and I still love Coleridge. I still love the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I'm very glad to have been introduced to it so early in life, and also for the reference to it in to lots of Coleridge in Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which in my early adolescence brought back an enthusiasm and interest in Coleridge. Another one of the big ones that I think really from my dad's enthusiasm we were introduced to quite early was Shakespeare, and I have memories of getting out the collected Shakespeare and getting out the dressing up box and sort of acting bits out and reading bits out. But a big way that we encountered Shakespeare as kids was through was through the films, and particularly through Romeo and Juliet, and the Zaffarelli film, which I have no idea how many times we watched. I've just got my big Norton Shakespeare as a placeholder for an individual copy of Romeo and Juliet. And again, it's just one of those ones where it's quite nice in a way that because I'd been exposed to it so early, every time I go back, I can just be surprised by the language instead of having to try and remember what's going on. It's it's a very familiar play to most people, and I can, like a lot of people, I think, use that to my advantage. And there's particularly one speech by Juliet where I'm always surprised by how almost gothic and dark and not quite despairing, but just brilliant her speech is. And yeah, anyway, I it's not my favourite Shakespeare play, but there's a kind of a richness to it, a kind of personal richness to my relationship with it because of how long I've spent with it, I suppose. And so that's one that, thinking of my childhood, is always there. And then the book that really, and again, I'm not really going into specific memories, they're sort of general bookish memories of childhood, so sorry about that. Maybe we can try and get into a few more specifics eventually. But next up is, if any book were to loom over my childhood, this would be the book, the obsession, and it's The Lord of the Rings. I've just got Fellowship of the Ring here. I absolutely loved Lord of the Rings. From my earliest memories, I can remember hearing my parents talking about it, my parents reading it and rereading it. Before the Peter Jackson films came out, there was the cartoon from the 70s, and then the Peter Jackson films as they were gradually coming out. And it was just an amazing obsession. And then around the age of 10, basically hearing that my dad had read Lord of the Rings when he was 10, and then we kind of set a competition to see whether I could do it too. And so then I sat down and read Lord of the Rings, and it took me, it basically took me a year at that age, but it was amazing. And I can still just remember the feeling of this feeling of feeling just so lucky that I'm able to do this thing, and it was an incredible feeling. The closest thing I can relate it to is finally learning an instrument. I can remember when I was very little, I loved Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and I really wanted to learn the violin. And I can remember the day, or maybe even the evening after I'd had my first violin lesson, and getting, just opening the case to look at it after I'd had my first lesson, and thinking, wow, this is actually happening now. I'm actually learning this instrument. And the same when I'd eventually start learning the guitar, and it kind of felt like that reading the Lord of the Rings. Like, oh wow, this can happen to me as well, and I get to do it. And it was amazing, and it took up a whole year of my imaginative life. I can remember I used to do a lot of dancing when I was young, and I can remember being in a dance exam and being right in the middle of the Council of Elrond, and just feeling like it was going to go on forever, kind of like waiting around for my turn in the dance exam, um, and yeah, and I can, they're just little periods. I can remember taking it into school for the little quiet reading periods that we'd have, and instead of taking a book from the school library, I'd take Lord of the Rings with me and read that instead. And yeah, it took a year, but it was worth it, and I've reread it since, and it's definitely, yeah, definitely still worth it. And then there is a jump in time, so they're kind of representing that earlier childhood and stuff that was just kind of always around in my childhood and adolescence. But it's telling that there's a gap now. The things that I would have kind of encountered a little bit before, but really I had my own personal encounters with at around the age of 16, 18, between 16 and 18. And they're books that I would have looked at, poems I would have looked at for my A levels. And it's just kind of telling that in that period between my A levels and reading Lord of the Rings, between the ages of 10 and 11, that my reading dropped. Well, I mean, yeah, my reading dropped off significantly. I would still read things I was required to read. I would occasionally read a book of my own volition, particularly when I was a teenager. I was very good at starting books, not terribly good at finishing them. And it was as I was, I think, doing my A levels in English that I got excited again. That there were moments of excitement, certain books that would surprise me, but really it was when I was doing my A levels, and particularly when it came to, it was the A levels that got me particularly excited about poetry. I can remember being younger in school, and we were looking at poetry and forms and how poetry changes over time, and using an example of two love poems, and there was one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and there was a Carol Ann Duffy poem about an onion. Um, and I can just remember being so underwhelmed by the Carol Ann Duffy poem. I've read a few poems by her that I like now, but at the time, I was like, oh, is that? I mean, is that where poetry has gone? Is it even worth reading poetry? And then I did my A levels, and well, it's telling the stuff I enjoyed then until I later encountered Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath and Seamus Heaney. I think that triptych was my kind of entryway into my own tastes in more recent poetry and into contemporary poetry. But it was telling that what got me really excited about poetry earlier on was romantics. And we've already had Coleridge, so maybe it's not that much of a surprise. But I've got two poems here, and I'm classing them as one book, even though they're it's two different poets, but they would have been in the same little anthology that we were working through. And the first would be The Tiger by William Blake. I would have already been familiar with this poem. My dad loves William Blake. I may as well, since both of these poems are short, I may as well read them both out. So we've got The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the Lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? And it's a famous, well-loved poem for good reason. And just the power of the imagery, that bit in the middle with the anaphora, with this constant what, and what the hand dare seize the fire, and what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart, and when thy heart began to beat, what dread hands and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread gasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? Just brilliant. And then my favourite stanza in all of English poetry, when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the Lamb make thee? So I just love that, the power of the language itself, the way it works metrically, and just the imagery, which is alive and shimmering and burning. And then the other one, another very famous poem of the Romantic period, a bit later on, but it's Shelley, and it's Ozymandias. And again, it's a short one, so I'll read it out. Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And again, I think it's sort of telling that it's a very short but very accomplished poem that just grabbed me and came alive in my mind at that time, and got me excited about reading poetry. And I've gone on to read tons more by Shelley and tons more than Blake, but those poems still have a very important resonance in my heart. And then moving away to going off to university, I thought I'd start off with a book that reminds me of the first few weeks of being away from home and of studying. And I did English literature, so I was reading books all the time. And there's one particular book I can remember, one of the first books I was studying, and so taking a day, I had just a whole day to catch up on some reading, and I went off to a coffee shop, and I just spent this rainy early autumn day in the coffee shop, and I was reading the Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and I may have just spent the whole day just reading this, and may have just read it in the whole day. I can't remember, but I remember that this was what I was reading, and drinking a lot of coffee, eating a lot of cake, and then yeah, it started getting dark, and I went back out into the rain, bumped into two friends, and just like, oh, what have you been doing? I was like, oh, I was just in the coffee shop reading. You know, I'm an English lit student. That's what I do, and just that seemed really exciting. It's like the best best thing, and it's still my favorite. You know, one of my favorite things to do, to go to a coffee shop and just read and read and read. And the other memory that I have attached to that time, that particular day, is I can remember I could hardly breathe, and it's telling that it was not long since I'd gone from home, and I'm not always making the best decisions, particularly when it came to laundry. And I had this, this woolly jumper, and I was in my student accommodation. I just had a tiny room, but we had a laundry nearby, and I could wash it, and I could put clothes in the tumble dryer, and I didn't want to put this woolly jumper in the tumble dryer. I was absolutely, I was frightened it would shrink and whatever. But I had nowhere to hang it up to dry or anything. And so I can remember hand washing it, hand washing it in the sink. I think I bought some laundry soap to hand wash it, and then I was like trying to work out where I could leave it to hang. I don't know why I just didn't put it in the kitchen or something of the shared flat I was in. But no, I decided to hang it up in my room where I was sleeping, on the radiator, which was right next to where my head was as I was sleeping. And so as I was asleep, I'm just breathing in all of this, all of this water vapor that's evaporating off my jumper as it's drying. Um, and I just remember waking up in the morning and just being like, and I just couldn't, I could hardly breathe at all. And I was like, oh well, I may as well get on with my day, even though I can't breathe. And I, picked up the Bluest Eye and went to the coffee shop, and that's what I did. And that, and then there was the later bit of the story I just told you. And yeah, I don't know why, but that whole day just sticks in my mind, and was a learning curve in quite a few ways. And the other book I often associate with that period, and with particularly my early laundry experiences at university, is James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which I can remember reading in the laundrette, waiting for my clothes, and it was the bit with the sermon on hell, and just I think I must have already had a bit of a headache, and then I was in the laundrette with all of the washing machines and tumble dryers going round and round and round, and then on top of that, this really intense sermon on hell, and I just had one of the worst headaches I've ever had in my life, and yeah, that sticks in my head as well. So that's my early time at university. The next book I want to talk about is Thomas Hardy, Far from the Madding Crowd, which is one of my favourite books, and this is one that I'm adding for, well, I suppose these are all quite sentimental reasons, but this is a book that I was reading when I was courting the woman who's now my wife, and we would go out on walks, and we would take a book with us and read it together. We'd alternate chapters, reading it out loud, and this was one of the books that we did. I think I read the first chapter by myself because it was a book I wanted to read, and then we started reading it out to each other. And so, you know, it's one of my favourite books, but I've never read it all the way through myself. You know, I've listened to half of it, and I've uh, read half of it with my eyes, but I've not had a complete experience either way. And so I'm quite curious to see what I'd make of it reading the whole thing on my own. And I know I like Thomas Hardy, so I don't think I'll hate it. But you know, just a very special period, and a great book to be reading out loud and out and about. Um, you know, with the birds singing and whatever. And then just two more books to go. Um, there are two periods I want to cover towards the end. One would be 2020 and lockdown, and then another book to um, signify my entry into BookTube. And so first up, the book for 2020, and there could have been any number of books I could have gone with, but I was particularly thinking of when spring kind of bled into into summer, and I can remember essentially having this massive pile of books that I was making my way through, and really trying to work out how to sort of frame this period. But I think, like a lot of people during COVID, you know, I put a lot of things on the back burner, whether intentionally or I mean, some things maybe I wasn't even conscious of putting them on the back burner. But one thing I really worked on and got better at was my own reading and my own just reading for fun. I'd really only been out of university. Let's see, I finished my masters in like the autumn of 2019. So by the time COVID struck, I'd maybe been out of university for 6 months or something. And so it was kind of still getting used to not being a student and not having people direct you and telling you what to read, which, although I had read other things for fun when I was a student, um, I still very much relied on that. And so during COVID, one of the things I really worked on was getting to things I wanted to read on my own. And I think finally starting a Goodreads was part of that. A lovely memory that I have of around April 2020 was spending the whole day trying to work out which books on the bookshelf that I'd read and hadn't read, and when I'd read them, and stuff like that, as I was setting up my my Goodreads account. And then, yeah, I with it being COVID, I had lots of time on my hands and was just jumping out of all kinds of different books, and it was, you know, a lovely distraction. But it meant that by the summer I had this big pile of about 10 books that I was in the middle of, and some of them were quite chunky. I can remember there was, you know, I was reading the Divine Comedy and the collected poems of Robert Lowell, and all kinds of things all at once. But I think there was one book that just felt like a moment of rest and stillness and all of that. And it's a book that I can remember taking with me on my walks, you know, when I was allowed to go out for walks, my 1 hour of exercise. And at the time there was a cathedral near where we lived, and I could walk out there and sit under a yew tree for you know, 10 or 20 minutes, and then do a bit of reading, and then walk home. And the book I can remember taking with me, I mean, I took loads of books with me, but the book that really sticks with me is the poetry of Rilke, and it was this Edward Snow translation. And I've loved Rilke since, and he's since become probably my favourite poet. I need to go back and do a lot more rereading, and I need to try some more translations. But I absolutely love Rilke, and just reading these poems was just a lovely anchor, I suppose, during that period. Um, yeah, I don't really know what else to say. I can just remember a few of the other places I took it. I can remember going to the beach. Once we were allowed sort of bubbles, sort of two households could meet up and go places together. And I can remember going to the beach with my sister and her husband and with Jasmine, my wife. And I can remember, I can't remember, they were talking about something, and I thought, oh, I'm just going to walk off and read some Rilke. So I picked up Rilke, and I walked off to the rock pools, and I just remember reading Rilke in the rock pools and then dropping the book in. So that was a fun adventure for this. And another time, again, sort of near the beach, there's a great place in South Wales called Dunraven Castle, and there's this lovely walled garden in there, and it's right by the sea, and you can just about hear the waves. But you're just in this lovely sheltered walled garden, and again, I can remember starting the Duino elegies for the first time from this edition in that walled garden, and the last time I read Sonnets to Orpheus, it was in the exact same place, and we'd gone back for a day, for an afternoon, and actually we'd gone out for a walk because it was just before my daughter was born, and we were trying to go out on walks to kind of encourage the birth to get going, and that would have been one of the last books I finished before she was born, and that would have been nearly a year and a half ago now, and I haven't read any Rilke since. So I need to go back and reread some Rilke. And I'm sorry that this is turning out to be quite a tangential video, but I suppose with memory, that's just the way it's going to go, isn't it? And then finally, a book about my ascendancy to BookTube. I discovered BookTube properly, I think, quite early in. It was either very late in 2020 or very early in 2021, which was just around the time that I was beginning to get a bit fed up with lockdowns and things. I kind of didn't mind them initially. I quite liked getting to stay inside and not do anything, and not have to, having those social obligations. And then it kind of dragged on a bit, and certainly by the end of the year, I'd gone through most of the spring and summer on furlough from my job, and then I was made redundant, and then just the craziness of trying to find a job during lockdowns. So all of that had been going on, and I was getting fed up, losing motivation, feeling increasingly motivated. Losing an increasing amount, or decreasing amount of increasingly losing motivation. And then I found BookTube, and it was just one. I mean, I've not really thought of what it would have been like had I not found it, but it definitely felt like a release valve. It definitely felt like it was, just filling a space in my life I hadn't quite noticed was empty and needed filling, and it just came at just the right time, and then I drummed up courage and started commenting, and sort of started realizing that some of these smaller, by comparison of the big channels that I'd encountered long before then, but people like Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, Lukash from a Cruel Reader's Thesis, Brian from Bookish, Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, Steve Donahue, and yeah, just sort of loads of other channels of that ilk. Sort of realising I was sort of coming into this little community, and it was just lovely. And then I drummed up the courage and started making my own videos. And then around in the summer, Mark from Book Time with Elvis did this thing for, it must have been for the Euros that were going on at that point, where if you wanted to sign up to the read along, you were given a country, a team, and then you had to read a book either set or written by someone from that country. And then if they were beaten by someone else, then you had to read a book by for the country that beat them, and so on and so on. And I signed up to it, and it was my first ever, my first ever group read on BookTube. And it was just so cool that all of these people who I watched their videos were in this little chat, all talking to each other, and I just remember getting really excited about it. And I was assigned Austria, and I can remember doing my research and trying to find books either set in Austria or about Austria or written by Austrians. And I eventually read a book that at least part of it is set in Austria. And I went with The Hare with Amber Eyes by Edmund de Waal, which turned out to be an amazing book, and a book that stayed with me, and a writer that I love, and I've enjoyed at least one other book by him since, and kind of want to go back and reread this. And this is also the book, one of a few, but one of the ones that sticks in my mind that made me want to retry Proust after having read Swan's Way and then given up this book, and one or two I read after convinced me to give Proust another try, which is a big bookish memory, all of its own. And so yeah, it's just a book that, for so many reasons, for the book itself, for that period in time, for what it represents with finding BookTube and being in my first group read, it's a book that I think very fondly of. When I think of my early time on BookTube, that's one of the first books that comes to mind. And I'll leave it there. I'm really sorry that this has turned into a really, really long video. I hope you don't mind too much. Let me know, for one, if we have any of these books in common, if any of these are books that have been significant for you and have important memories and resonances to you. And if not, let me know a handful of any other books that stand out for you and are these touchstones in your life. So I'll leave it there. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you're doing very well, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.